A poor girl says to the billionaire CEO, "Hi, sir, my mother told me to find you before she died." Before the story begins, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The rain fell hard against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Harrington Tower, 70 stories of glass and steel clawing at the gray Manhattan sky. From his corner office on the top floor, Everett Harrington stood in silence, watching the storm dance across the skyline. His hands were buried deep in the pockets of a tailored charcoal suit, the fabric untouched by time, like the man who wore it. To the world, Everett was a titan, one of the last great self-made men, the kind people whispered about in boardrooms and business schools alike. Just last month, Forbes had crowned him the ninth wealthiest man in America. But on this particular morning, with thunder rolling in the distance and clouds painting the city in sorrowful hues, none of it mattered. He heard the buzz of the intercom before he turned around. "Mr. Harrington." Harrington, his assistant's voice crackled through the speaker. "There's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she's very persistent." Everett didn't move. His voice was low, steady. "Tell her to make an appointment like everyone else." "I tried, sir, but she said it's about a woman named Lillian Carter." The name hit him like the echo of a ghost, a name buried in memory, untouched for over 2 decades. For a moment, Everett said nothing. His back stiffened, his shoulders squared. Then slowly, almost unwillingly, he turned toward his desk. "Send her in." The door opened, and in stepped a young woman, no more than 22, perhaps 23, with damp hair clinging to her cheeks and a jacket too thin for the weather. Her jeans were worn at the knees, her shoes soaked through. She didn't belong here, not in this world of marble floors and million-dollar artwork, but she stood tall, shoulders back, as if daring the room to dismiss her. But it was her eyes that caught him, dark and intelligent, searching. There was something familiar in them, something that made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. "You have 5 minutes," Everett said, motioning to the chair, but not insisting she take it. She didn't. She stepped forward, gently placing a small, leather-bound book on his desk. Her voice was soft but unwavering. "My name is Clara Carter. Lillian Carter was my mother." Past tense. It stabbed like a blade between his ribs. "She died 3 weeks ago," Clara continued, and though her eyes shimmered, her voice did not break. "Pancreatic cancer. At the end, she asked me to find you, said you deserve to have this." Everett glanced at the worn journal on his desk but didn't touch it. He couldn't, not yet. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said carefully, his tone as unreadable as his face. "But I haven't seen your mother in 23 years. I don't know what she thought I could do for you." "I'm not here for money," Clara said quickly, the words edged with pride. "I'm here because I made her a promise." Her fingers brushed the journal. "She said to give you this, that it was important, and she said to tell you that she was sorry, that she never stopped loving you." Everett felt the floor tilt beneath him. Not physically, but something within him shifted, something long buried. His hand moved slightly, gripping the edge of the desk just a bit too tightly. There were days when he thought he'd forgotten Lillian, forced her memory into some forgotten corner of his past. But that wasn't the truth. You don't forget someone like her. You just learn to live without her, or pretend you do. "How do I know you're who you say you are?" he asked, the mask returning, though the storm inside him raged louder now. Clara reached into her bag again, this time pulling out a faded photograph. She laid it gently beside the journal. "She kept this by her bed, always." He looked down. The picture was old, creases running through its corners, but still clear. There he was, younger, with his arm wrapped around a woman with wild auburn hair and a smile that could silence any room. Lillian. And beside her, caught mid-laughter, was Everett himself, barefoot on a beach somewhere he no longer remembered the name of, but the moment. It came back with terrifying clarity. That was the day before everything fell apart. He looked up again, meeting Clara's steady gaze. "Leave your contact information with my assistant," he said finally, voice low. I'll have someone verify your story." "I don't need anything from you," she said, her chin lifting slightly. "I kept my promise. That's all I came to do." She turned to go, the strength in her step belying the grief she carried like a weight on her back. But before she reached the door, something in Everett gave way. Wait, she paused. How did she die? Clara turned back, her expression softening just slightly. Fast. At the end, it was fast. I was with her. Her last words were your name. The silence that followed was unbearable. She looked at him once more, then added, I work mornings at a place called Elridge Cafe on 46th. If you ever want to talk about her, that's where I'll be. Then she left, and Everett was alone again, staring down at a leather journal that suddenly weighed more than any deal he'd ever signed. He didn't open it, not yet. He waited until the building emptied, until the rain turned to a whisper and the city lights burned through the mist like stars. Only then did he flip open the first page. One sentence stared back at him in Lillian's familiar handwriting. Everett, there are truths you deserve to know. The journal sat on Everett Harrington's desk for hours, untouched, unspoken for, its leather worn, its corners curled like it had traveled through time itself. Outside, the storm had quieted, replaced by the gentle hum of traffic far below and the glow of city lights bleeding into the night. But inside that penthouse office, something louder churned, unseen but relentless, a storm that had been building in him for 23 long, hollow years. His empire stretched across continents. His signature had changed industries. His net worth printed in gold ink in glossy magazines. But none of that could prepare him for this moment. Not for this little book. Not for the memory of a woman who had once meant everything and then disappeared like a ghost into the fog of ambition and regret. He sat, slowly, like a man settling into something sacred, something dangerous. His fingers hovered over the cover before finally, they rested there. It was warm from the heat of his palm, as if the journal remembered her hands before his. For a long time, he simply stared, trying to will himself to turn the first page. But something inside him, a younger version of himself perhaps, buried under decades of cold deals and sharper decisions, whispered that once he opened this, he could never close it again. Still, he opened it. The first page was simple. Her handwriting flowed in the same style he remembered, gentle, looping, always precise but never cold. Her words felt like her voice, soft and musical, echoing through his memory like a half-forgotten song. Everett, there are truths you deserve to know. And just like that, he was back. Back on a beach in Maine, salt in the air and sand in his shoes, her laughter carrying on the wind like light. Back in a tiny Brooklyn apartment where they used to lie awake until morning, talking about everything and nothing. Back in a time when the world was full of promise, before ambition turned to obsession, and before the man who once whispered dreams into her ear became the stranger who now sat at a desk built on sacrifices. He turned the page. The entries were not dated in a traditional sense, but they followed a timeline, a love story told in fragments. Some pages were long, filled with reflections, while others were short, just a line or two, raw and heartbreaking. Each word peeled away the years between them. Her writing wasn't angry, it wasn't bitter, it was mournful, honest, brave. I left because I was afraid of what you were becoming. Not because I stopped loving you. That never changed. The words hit him like waves, relentless and pulling. Everett found himself gripping the journal tighter, as if it might fly away and take her with it again. She hadn't just vanished. She had run. Run from him, from what he was becoming. There were entries about the early years, when they lived off little more than hope and ramen noodles, when he used to bring her wildflowers from sidewalk vendors, and whispered that someday they'd build a life people would envy. But then came the shift. The subtle notes of worry in her writing, concerns about how late he worked, how distant he had become, how he'd started to measure success in numbers and acquisitions rather than moments in love. I tried to talk to you, but I think you were already gone. You were there, Everett, but your heart was somewhere else, somewhere cold. He swallowed hard, blinking away the sting of memory. There was one entry that made his hands tremble. I found out I was pregnant the week after you made your first $1 million deal. I didn't know how to tell you. I wanted to believe you'd be thrilled that we'd celebrate. But you came home that night with a different glow, one made of dollar signs, not dreams. I saw the future in your eyes. and it didn't have room for me, or for a child. He stood up too quickly, knocking the chair back. His breath came fast, shallow. For a moment, he paced the room like a caged animal, the weight of her words crashing down on him. A child? He stared at the window, the city stretching beneath him, glowing and uncaring. Somewhere out there, a child might have grown up without him. That child, Clara, had stood before him just hours ago, and he hadn't known, couldn't have known. But now, he went back to the journal, turning page after page, searching for more, and he found it. I named her Clara. I chose that name because it means bright, clear. She was the only thing that felt certain in a life that suddenly wasn't. She has your eyes, Everett, your stubbornness. Sometimes when she laughs, I swear I hear your voice. His knees gave way and he sank onto the couch near the window, the journal cradled in his lap like something holy. His heart beat painfully against his ribs, like it was trying to escape and run back through time. I wanted to tell you, I did, but every time I came close, I saw how far you'd gone, how many steps you'd taken away from the man I loved. I couldn't risk her being another deal you walked away from. I couldn't risk her becoming collateral damage in a life built on profit. Everett wiped a hand down his face. His throat burned. This wasn't a simple story of a lost love anymore. This was the story of a family that almost was, a life he never knew he'd missed until it was too late. Or was it? Clara's face appeared in his mind again. The way she stood, defiant but respectful. The way she said she didn't want anything from him, only to keep her mother's promise. There was a strength in her, but there was pain too. Pain she likely carried alone for a long time. He wondered how many birthdays he had missed. How many graduations? First steps? First words. Was it his voice she had wished to hear cheering her on from the sidelines? And what had Lillian gone through? A single mother in a city that swallows people whole. Had she struggled in silence? Too proud to ask for help? Too hurt to reach out? He found another entry near the end. I know what kind of man you became, Everett. I've watched your name climb the news and the finance pages. I've seen your face in magazines, always composed, always powerful. But in the quiet hours, I still see the man who used to carry my camera bag and sing off-key to jazz records. I wonder if he's still in there somewhere. I hope he is, because Clara deserves to meet him. She deserves to know you, not just your shadow. And at the very end, written in the thinnest, faintest ink, likely from shaking hands, if you ever read this, promise me you'll look into her eyes and truly see her, not as a mistake or an obligation, but as a gift. The only one I could leave behind. He couldn't breathe. Everett closed the journal, holding it against his chest like it might bring her back. The rain outside began again, soft this time, like a lullaby. In the stillness of the office, the silence was no longer comfortable. It was crushing. He stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out, the journal still in hand. He didn't wait for his driver, didn't check his phone, didn't respond to the assistant who called his name as he passed. He took the elevator down and stepped into the street, letting the drizzle soak into his clothes. He needed to move, to see her, to see Clara, not just to talk, not just to answer questions, but to look her in the eyes and decide what came next. Because something inside him was waking up, a feeling he hadn't known in decades. Not guilt, not duty, hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. That a story interrupted by time, silence, and pride might still find a second chapter. That his heart, so long buried beneath steel and concrete, might still have something left to give. He didn't know what Clara would say. He didn't know if she'd let him in, but he knew he had to try. Because when the woman you loved once upon a time reaches out from beyond the grave and tells you the most beautiful part of your life might still be waiting for you, you don't ignore that. You run toward it. And as Everett disappeared into the night, journal pressed to his chest and his steps growing faster beneath the soft fall of rain, the listener could feel it. The turning of a tide, the ache of a man reckoning with love, long lost, and the whisper of a story still unfolding. Because this wasn't the end. No, this was only the beginning. The next morning, Everett Harrington did something he hadn't done in decades. He ignored the empire he had built. His assistant had left a list of urgent meetings on his desk. His phone was flooded with messages from board members demanding his attention, and yet none of it mattered. The world could wait. For once, he wasn't a CEO, a billionaire, or the face of Harrington Industries. He was just a man chasing the pieces of a life he didn't know he had lost. The rain had cleared, leaving the city washed clean, the air crisp with the lingering scent of last night's storm. Everett wasn't accustomed to taking cabs, but he hailed one anyway, instructing the driver to take him to El Ridge Cafe on the 46th. It was a small place, not the sort of establishment frequented by men in tailored suits. But today, appearances didn't matter. He arrived just after 9, stepping inside to the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the low hum of morning chatter. The cafe was modest, filled mostly with college students, young professionals, and retirees nursing their cups in quiet solitude. The contrast between this world and the towering one he usually inhabited was stark. Here, there were no high-stakes negotiations, no ruthless takeovers, no numbers flashing across digital screens dictating fortunes. Just people. Real, ordinary people. And then he saw her. Clara moved swiftly behind the counter, her sleeves rolled up, her dark hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. She greeted customers with a polite smile, took orders with quiet efficiency, but there was something in the way she carried herself that struck him. An exhaustion. A weight. It wasn't just physical fatigue, it was deeper than that. The kind of tiredness that settled into the bones. The kind that didn't come from long shifts, but from life itself. For the first time he truly saw her. A young woman who had spent her life carrying burdens she shouldn't have had to bear. He waited until she noticed him. At first, her brows furrowed, as if she wasn't sure she was seeing correctly. Then, when recognition dawned, her expression shifted from surprise to something unreadable. "You came," she said simply, wiping her hands on a rag. "I did." She glanced at the clock. "I don't get off until 2. "I'll wait." She blinked at that. I am caught off guard. Perhaps she had expected him to hand her a check and walk away, to dismiss her presence the way powerful men often did when faced with inconvenient truths. But instead, and he took a seat at the corner table and waited for 3 hours. The customers came and went. The morning rush faded into the lull of late morning, but Everett remained, silent and patient. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the cafe, and though she said nothing, her gaze softened. Just a little. At precisely 2 o'clock, Clara disappeared into the back room, emerging minutes later without her apron, her hair now loose around her shoulders. She hesitated, then walked to his table. "There's a park a few blocks away," she said. "We can walk." He followed her out, the two of them strolling in silence through the damp streets until they reached a small, quiet park. There was something peaceful about it. The trees still held onto the last of their autumn leaves, the ground scattered with gold and rust-colored remnants of the season. She sat on a bench, he did the same. Finally, she spoke. "Did you read it? The journal?" He nodded. Every word. Clara was quiet for a long time. Then she asked the question that had been waiting between them since the moment she stepped into his office. "Why did she leave you?" Everett exhaled slowly. "Because she was right." Clara turned her head toward him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "She saw what I was becoming long before I did," he continued, his voice steady but distant. "Ambition consumed me. I told myself I was doing it for us, but the truth is, I was doing it for myself. There was never going to be a stopping point. No finish line where I finally said, 'This is enough.' Lillian knew that, and she knew she had to make a choice." Clara's fingers twisted in her lap. "And you never looked for her?" "I did," he admitted. 10 years ago, I hired a private investigator. He told me she was married. Happy. I thought I had no right to interfere." Clara's jaw tightened. "She wasn't married." Everett turned sharply to face her. "She never remarried," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm. "She told me once that she couldn't because she had already given her heart away." His hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to relax. "I thought I was protecting her." "She never needed protection," Clara replied. "She needed you." The words struck deep, but Everett didn't flinch. He had spent a lifetime constructing armor around his emotions. But here, now, with Clara sitting beside him, He let it fall away. After a long pause, he said, "I'd like to know more about her. The Lillian I never got to see." Clara studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, let's go." She took him to the place she and Lillian had called home, a modest apartment in Brooklyn, tucked away on a quiet street. Inside, it was small but warm, filled with pieces of a life Everett had never been part of. Photographs lined the walls, Lillian with a camera in hand, Lillian laughing, Lillian holding a baby girl with dark eyes that mirrored his own. Everett stepped forward, staring at a particular photograph. It was of a sunrise, the light breaking through storm clouds over the ocean. "She had a copy of that on her nightstand," Clara said, "until the day she died." Everett swallowed hard. He remembered the moment that picture had been taken. The morning after he had first told Lillian he loved her, a moment she had carried with her for 23 years. His gaze flickered to the hospital bed in the corner of the living room, long since empty, but still an echo of the suffering that had unfolded here. He imagined Lillian in those final days, weak, fading, but still thinking of him. The weight of it was unbearable. "I should have been there," he whispered, more to himself than to Clara. Clara turned, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You still can be." Everett looked at her, really looked at her, and in that moment he understood. It wasn't just about the past. It wasn't about regret or lost time. It was about now. About the daughter sitting in front of him, waiting for him to decide if he would step forward or walk away. "I want to be in your life," he said, his voice steady but full of something rare, emotion. "If you'll let me." Clara inhaled sharply. She had spent her entire life wondering about the man in the photographs, the man her mother never stopped loving. And now he was here. She wiped at her eyes quickly, then lifted her chin. "All right, but on one condition." Everett tilted his head. "Name it." "You have to let me see where you work," she said. "The real you, not the version that waits at coffee shops." For the first time in what felt like forever, Everett chuckled, a real, honest laugh. "Fair enough," he said. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock." As they left the apartment, Everett turned back one last time, taking in the home that had been built without him. It was painful, but there was hope in it too, because the past couldn't be changed. But the future, that was still unwritten. There's something sacred about slow healing, about two people, both battered by time and choices, finding their way back to something that might have been, had the world tilted just slightly differently. Over the weeks that followed that first quiet walk through the park, Everett Harrington and Clara Carter found themselves doing something neither of them expected. They began to meet, again and again, not as strangers forced together by a ghost's final request, but as something else, something harder to define. Somewhere between grief and hope, between suspicion and trust, they were building a bridge, one hesitant step at a time. Their meetings became a ritual, gentle, unspoken, and always unplanned. Sometimes it was a walk in the park before Clara's shift at the cafe. Other days, Everett would arrive early, sitting at his usual corner table, sipping coffee that was far too bitter, but strangely comforting, just to exchange a few moments with her. Once, he helped her carry groceries home, surprised by how small her apartment really was. The space was barely enough for one person, let alone two full-time jobs, and the emotional weight of losing a mother. He didn't say it out loud, but seeing how she lived, how hard she worked, hit him harder than any business deal ever had. And yet, Clara never complained. She didn't ask for sympathy. She never asked for help. Instead, she shared pieces of herself slowly, carefully, like slipping small notes into a jar for safekeeping. She talked about Lillian, how her mother had taught her to see the world through a lens of wonder, how she had inherited her passion for photography, even if she couldn't afford the equipment. She confessed she had been accepted to 3 Ivy League schools but chose NYU to stay close to home when her mother's health declined. And when the bills started piling up, Clara quietly dropped out and started waiting tables, shelving dreams she once held close to her heart. Everett listened, not the way he listened in boardrooms or investor calls, but truly listened. And each time she spoke, another thread of guilt wrapped around his heart. What would her life have been like had he known? Had he been there? Would she have graduated with honors? Would she have traveled the world with a camera slung around her shoulder and a smile of freedom on her face? The questions haunted him, But for every pain she shared, Everett offered her something in return, a glimpse into the man he used to be before the world taught him that success meant sacrifice. He spoke about the early days of his career when he and Lillian used to dream on rooftops, watching the city lights sparkle like stars. He told her about the first time he made $1 million and how strangely empty it had felt without someone to come home to. He confessed that he'd lost pieces of himself along the way, traded for conference rooms, power, and respect. There were moments, he admitted once, as they sat watching children play in the park, when I stood in rooms filled with people, powerful people, and felt utterly alone. Clara didn't speak, but she reached into her bag, pulled out a small Polaroid, and handed it to him. It was of her and Lillian, sitting on a rooftop, a plastic telescope between them. She used to say the stars didn't care how much money you made, Clara said softly. They only came out when it was dark. Everett stared at the photo, the corners of his mouth twitching in something that wasn't quite a smile. She always was wiser than me. As their meetings continued, their conversations deepened. They stopped dancing around the question that had once cast a long shadow over them. The test, the journal, the uncertainty of bloodlines. But what had started as a question of biology was slowly becoming something more, a question of belonging. I don't know if you're my father, Clara said one afternoon, her voice steady but low, and I don't know if it would change anything if you were. Everett looked at her then, not with the sterile gaze of a businessman analyzing a problem, but with the quiet wonder of a man who had just discovered something precious. It would change everything, he said, because I would have something I never thought I'd find again. Clara studied him carefully. What's that? A reason. It was in that moment, under the rustling trees and the fading afternoon sun, that Clara saw something in Everett's eyes that wasn't power, or money, or regret. It was longing, not for the past, but for the future, a future that might still hold something warm and real. And slowly the walls between them began to fall. Clara invited him to one of her favorite places, an old record store tucked between a bookstore and a bakery in Greenwich Village. The kind of place where time moves slower, where the walls smelled like nostalgia and the floors creaked with secrets. They spent nearly an hour flipping through dusty covers and debating over jazz artists and vinyl warps. He hadn't laughed like that in years, not since Lillian. It was laughter that came from the belly, the kind that leaves your eyes damp and your chest light. Another time she took him to the community center where she volunteered on weekends, tutoring kids who struggled with reading. Everett watched her kneel beside a little piano, her tone soft and encouraging, her patience unwavering. He saw something bloom in her that had nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with heart. That night, Everett couldn't sleep. He sat in his penthouse surrounded by glass and gold, but all he could think about was her quiet strength, her warmth, her fire. And the question that he hadn't dared ask himself out loud until now, what if this was his second chance at family? Dear listener, if you've ever lived long enough to feel the stinging of time, if you've ever wondered what might have been if you'd made a different choice or picked a different road, then maybe you'll understand why Everett Harrington, billionaire magnate, man of the hour, began to change. He no longer checked the markets the moment he woke. He spent less time in meetings, more time walking through the city. He'd call Clara just to ask how her day went. Sometimes he showed up at the cafe before closing, not to talk, but simply to sit, to be near her. Because sometimes love doesn't roar, it whispers. And sometimes family isn't built with blood. It's built with time and patience and presence. But friends, if you've been listening this far, you know it couldn't stay this simple for long. The past has a cruel way of surfacing when you least expect it. One morning, as Everett sat in the cafe reading a book Clara had lent him, a woman walked in wearing red heels and a coat that cost more than most people's rent. Victoria Chambers. Clara didn't recognize her, but Everett did. He stood slowly, his body instinctively bracing, like a soldier back on the battlefield. Victoria, he said tightly. Victoria smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Darling, I didn't realize you frequented coffee shops now. Clara moved closer, sensing something shift. This must be her, Victoria said with mock sweetness, her gaze sliding over Clara like a blade. The girl from the journal. Victoria. Oh, relax, she interrupted. I just came to say hello, to see the person who's suddenly taken up so much of your time. Clara's jaw tightened. She looked at Everett, confused. Who is she? Everett hesitated. A mistake, he said simply. Victoria's smile faded. She turned, her heels clicking against the floor as she exited, leaving tension hanging in her wake. Later that evening, Clara asked him again, Who is she really? Everett looked her in the eyes. She's someone who wanted control. Of me. Of the company. Maybe even more. And now? Clara asked. She wants to protect what she thinks she's earned. And you scare her. Why? Because you remind me who I used to be. There was silence after that. The kind of silence that holds space for truth. Clara reached for her phone and pulled up a picture. It was of her and Lillian, standing beneath a willow tree, their faces lit by sunlight. She believed in second chances, Clara said. She just never got hers. Everett looked at the photo, then at Clara. I think I finally believe in them too. Dear listeners, if you believe people can change, if you believe that even the coldest hearts can thaw when touched by the right hand, if you believe that love, even after decades of silence, can still bloom, then let Clara and Everett hear it. Hit the like button, leave a comment, share a word of hope or a prayer for a man trying to mend the past and a daughter finding her place in a story written before she could speak. Because their journey isn't over. Not yet. This is only the middle. And what comes next? Well, you'll want to stay for that. Victoria Chambers had always been a patient woman, cold, calculating, and endlessly composed, yes, but above all, patient. She knew how to wait, how to smile through silence, and how to let the pieces of a long game fall exactly where she intended. For 20 years, she'd done just that, climbed every rung of the corporate ladder inside Harrington Industries with the elegance of a ballerina and the venom of a chess master. She had made herself indispensable, trusted, respected, feared, but not loved. Never loved. Not by the one man who had ever mattered, Everett Harrington. She had studied him longer than anyone else, learned the rhythm of his mind, the weight of his ambition, the silent voids that haunted him even on his best days. She knew the version of him the world applauded, and the darker one he kept hidden behind polished goss and polished smiles. She had been part of his inner circle once, his confidant, his lover briefly, but always, always second to someone who wasn't even there anymore. Lillian Carter. Victoria could never compete with a ghost, and worse, she knew it. So when that girl, Clara, had walked into Everett's office that rainy morning, Victoria's world had shifted on its axis. At first, it was curiosity, then concern, then something far more dangerous, fear. Because Clara wasn't just a girl with questions. She was her daughter, Lillian's child, and perhaps his. That possibility had turned something ice cold in Victoria's chest. She had spent her entire career helping Everett rise, shaping his image, his company, his future. She had protected his interests even when he didn't ask her to. She had built her identity around him, around the plan. And now, just when she was close, so very close, to finalizing the Monarch merger, a deal that would seal her legacy and secure her power, Clara Carter appeared like a specter from a past she had worked very hard to bury. Victoria wasn't stupid. She had Clara followed, not out of paranoia, but strategy. She learned quickly that Clara wasn't after money. She wasn't trying to leverage her bloodline or stake a claim. If anything, the girl seemed decent, too decent, working 2 jobs, volunteering with children, living in an apartment that Victoria wouldn't even use for storage. But that made her more dangerous, not less. Because Everett was changing. He was smiling more, spending less time in the office, more time out with her. And that could not be allowed to continue. The Monarch deal required a transition of power. Everett stepping back, Victoria stepping in. She had lined it all up, the board support, the investor buy-ins, even the media rollout. The last thing she needed was a long-lost daughter complicating the equation with sentiment and legacy talk. And so she acted. First, she had the DNA test altered, a well-placed favor, a file scrubbed clean, a record manipulated. It wasn't difficult. People could be bought. Systems could be breached. The truth could be rewritten with a keystroke. The test came back negative. Everett was not the father. He didn't say much when he got the news. He was never a man who revealed his wounds. But Victoria saw the crack form behind his eyes. It was enough. Enough to make him hesitate, to begin to pull away from Clara. Or so she thought. But the girl didn't leave. She stayed. Steady, gentle, always showing up. And Everett, despite his confusion, kept showing up too. Victoria watched it unfold like a nightmare in slow motion. She saw them walking in the park, talking outside the cafe. She even followed Everett once when he visited that apartment in Brooklyn, that shrine to Lillian's memory. The photographs, the books, the chipped mugs and flowered curtains. All the things he once promised Victoria, but never gave her. That's when it changed for her. That's when Victoria knew. Clara had to go, but she couldn't be obvious. She tried subtle sabotage at first, accidentally misplacing reports, excluding Clara from event guest lists, slipping in comments at board meetings about Everett's sudden distraction and emotional entanglements. Still, Clara endured. Still, Everett refused to push her away. Then came the day Victoria couldn't bear to be silent anymore. She arrived at the cafe mid-morning dressed in crimson because red had always been her war paint. The place smelled like cinnamon and burnt espresso, too small and too loud for her tastes. She found Everett sitting at a table near the window, a second coffee already waiting across from him. Waiting for Clara. Victoria walked up, cool and uninvited. "Darling," she said, "I didn't realize you were enjoying the simple life now." Everett didn't rise. His eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same." Just then Clara appeared, apron still tied, cheeks flushed from rushing. Victoria turned, tilting her head slightly, taking in the girl up close. "So this is her, the one with all the answers." Clara blinked, thrown off by the stranger's sudden presence. "And who are you?" she asked, not rudely, but firmly. Victoria smiled, teeth barely visible. "No one important, just someone who used to know your father, intimately." Clara's eyes flicked to Everett. Confusion etched across her features. "Leave," Everett said sharply. Victoria turned, not before letting her gaze rest one last time on Clara. "You should be careful," she murmured. "Some truths aren't worth digging up." And then she was gone. The damage, however, lingered. Later that evening, Clara confronted Everett on a park bench, the same bench where they'd laughed just days before. "Who is she really?" she asked. Everett was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Someone who mistook ambition for love." Clara's face softened. "And now?" "She's a woman trying to protect something that never belonged to her." "Why is she afraid of me?" Clara asked. Everett turned to her then, a strange mixture of pride and sorrow in his eyes. "Because you're the only person I've ever let pass the walls I built. Because you remind me of what I lost, and what I still might have." Young, for a moment they just sat there, quiet and still. But dear listener, you and I both know the truth always has a way of clawing its way back to the surface. That night, Everett couldn't sleep. He kept turning Lillian's journal over in his hands, haunted by a single line near the end. "I wonder if you ever realized what was stolen from us." Stolen. The word burrowed deep. It wasn't just a poetic flourish. It was a warning. Everett picked up the phone and called his head of security. "Check the medical records," he said. "I want to know if anyone tampered with the test." What he uncovered made his blood run cold. The test had been altered. The original results, still buried in the system, showed a 99.9% match. Clara was his daughter. Victoria had known, and she had lied. The betrayal hit like a blade. But Everett didn't rage. He didn't yell. He simply stared out of the window, the city lights flickering like distant stars, and whispered to no one, "She almost took her from me again." He knew what he had to do. And listener, this is where you come in. Because Everett Harrington, this man so many once called ruthless and unfeeling, is about to confront the woman who tried to erase his child. He's about to make a choice that could destroy the foundation of everything he built, but might finally give him back the one thing he never knew he truly needed. So if you've ever seen a person rise from the ashes of their own mistakes, if you've ever believed that second chances aren't just for the innocent, but for the broken too, if you've ever hoped that love, not power, is what really endures, Then leave a comment below. Let Everett know you're with him. Let Clara feel your encouragement as she stands on the edge of discovering where she truly comes from. Because the storm isn't over. And what comes next? It will test everything. Stay with me. You won't want to miss it. Everett Harrington sat perfectly still in the back seat of his town car, one hand pressed over his chest, as though the words he had just heard were physical things, sharp, jagged, cruel, and had sliced through him on their way in. Mr. Harrington, the results are in. Based on the DNA profile submitted, there is a 9.7% certainty that you are not the biological father of Miss Clara Carter. He hadn't responded. Not then, not for a full 30 seconds. He had simply stared through the tinted glass at the city outside, its flashing lights, its people in a hurry to get somewhere, anywhere. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like none of it meant a thing. He was not her father. The words echoed, hollow and relentless, as if repeating them might somehow dull the sting. But it didn't. It never would. He didn't know how he made it through the rest of the day. Didn't remember the rest of the ride back to the office. The board meeting, the calls, the press releases, the billion-dollar Monarch acquisition that had just landed. All of it happened around him like a dream, and he drifted through it like a ghost, nodding, signing, smiling for the cameras, while inside, something was breaking. Because for weeks now, maybe longer, he had let himself believe. Not just believe, but hope. He had told himself it didn't matter whether or not she was his daughter. He had said the bond they were forming wasn't dependent on blood or biology, that love could grow in the absence of certainty. But it had mattered. It did. Because in Clara's eyes, he had seen the second chance he never thought he'd get. The flicker of a future where he could be more than a legacy of cold steel and tall buildings. He could be something warm, something lasting, something real. And now that hope had been shattered by a single sentence, delivered in the flat tone of a medical technician over a sterile phone line. He should have expected this. He had told himself not to get too close, not to build castles in the clouds. But how do you stop your heart from imagining what your head warns against? How do you sit across from a young woman who walks like her mother, speaks with her quiet fire, and laughs like sunlight on glass, and not feel something rise up in you, something ancient and sacred and aching to be true? Clara. Her name alone made his throat tighten. How was he going to tell her? What would he even say? "You're not mine" felt like a betrayal, not just of her, but of everything they'd shared. The walks, the talks, the long silences that spoke volumes. He remembered the way she'd held his hand at her mother's grave, how her fingers had trembled, just slightly, as if they, too, were asking for something. Connection, comfort, clarity. And he had offered it freely. What right did he have to take it back? The next morning, he stood in front of her door in Brooklyn, holding the truth like a stone in his pocket. The air was crisp, the streets wet from an early rain. It should have felt fresh, cleansing, but all he felt was dread. She opened the door with a soft smile, tired maybe, but welcoming. "You're early," she said, stepping aside. "I couldn't wait," he replied, voice low. Inside, the apartment was warm, cluttered in the way that only living spaces are. Books piled on shelves, photos taped to the refrigerator, laundry hanging by the radiator. It smelled like cinnamon and jasmine tea. Like her. He sat on the couch. She handed him a cup of tea without asking. Just like her mother used to, and then she looked at him. "What is it?" she asked, and suddenly the words wouldn't come. He looked down, then back up, and something in his eyes must have changed, because Clara set her tea down slowly, carefully. "You got the results," she said, and it wasn't a question. He nodded. "And?" He tried to speak, but his throat closed. She exhaled, then said softly, "I already know, I could tell." "You're not my daughter," he whispered, hating the sound of it, the feel of it in his mouth. Clara didn't move. Her face was unreadable, but something in her posture shifted, like a wind had passed through her and left her standing in its wake. She nodded once slowly. "I see." The silence that followed was a living thing. "I'm sorry," he said. Clara looked at him, really looked, and when she spoke, her voice was calm but distant. "For what? That I'm not yours or that you wanted me to be?" He opened his mouth, but she raised a hand. "Don't, please." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. My whole life, she said, I wondered, not just who my father was, but if he'd even care, if he'd be proud, if I'd remind him of her. I used to imagine what it would feel like to be wanted, to belong. Her voice caught just once, and then you showed up. And for a minute, I let myself believe that maybe I'd found him. Not just a name, not a bank account, a person. You listened to me. You saw me. She paused. And now that's over. No, Everett said quickly, standing. No, Clara, that's not what this means. Isn't it? She asked, not bitter, but tired. You have what you came for, an answer. And I go back to being no one's. He reached for her hand, but she stepped back, not in anger, just self-protection. And that broke him, because she wasn't asking for money or inheritance or fame. She was asking not to be abandoned. Not again. Claire, he said, voice hoarse, you're not no one, and this doesn't change how I feel. She looked away, then back. But it changes what we are. That night, Everett didn't return to his penthouse. He drove without purpose through the city, ending up parked on a quiet street, staring at the journal again. Lillian's words danced across the pages, full of heartbreak and longing, and then one line stopped him. If you're reading this, Everett, and she found you, promise me you'll look into her eyes and truly see her, not for what the world says she is, but for what she is to me. My heart, my light. He closed the journal and pulled out his phone. I want you to check the lab, he told his head of security. Pull everything, access logs, staff records, cross-check all digital entries. I want to know if there's any chance, that those results were tampered with. The call ended, and Everett waited. Hours passed. Then came the call that would change everything. There was a breach, the voice on the other end said. The original result was positive. You are her father. Everett closed his eyes. His knees gave out. Clara was his daughter, and someone had tried to erase that. Victoria. Of course it was her. He didn't wait. He didn't plan. He stormed into the office the next morning before dawn. Security footage, digital logs, confidential files, he gathered everything. By noon, he stood outside Clara's apartment again. She opened the door, guarded now. I need to talk to you, he said. I'm not sure I want to hear more, she said, stepping back. But something in his face must have stopped her. He handed her a folder. She opened it, read the page, and the world shifted. You're my daughter, he said. Clara's hands trembled. No. Yes, Everett said. Victoria lied. She changed the results. I found the original test. It was a match. It was always a match. She sank onto the couch, unable to speak, and he sat beside her. I didn't lose you, he whispered. I didn't miss my chance. Clara looked up, eyes brimming. But I did, she said. For years. You were out there, I was here, and she kept us apart. I know, he said, and I'm sorry. She nodded, once, slowly. Then softly she said, What now? He reached for her hand again. This time she let him. Now he said, We begin. Have you ever waited your whole life to be seen? To be known? Have you ever carried the ache of what if inside your chest, like a stone too heavy to put down? Then perhaps you understand why this moment matters. Clara Carter is no longer just a girl searching for her past. She's a daughter. And Everett Harrington is no longer just a man of steel and strategy. He's a father, and all because they refused to give up on hope, on truth, on each other. So if this story moved you, if you felt their ache, their longing, their quiet triumph, leave a comment below. Let them hear your heart. Encourage them. Stand with them, because the story is far from over. And together, we'll see where it leads next. Everett Harrington sat alone in the quiet of his penthouse, the city humming far below his window like a restless heartbeat. The light stretched endlessly into the night, glittering like cold promises he no longer believed in. On the table before him lay the evidence, a folder fat with secrets and the torn thread of a life he never got to live. Inside, the truth lived in ink and time-stamped data, the original DNA test. Unaltered, unforged, undeniable. Clara was his daughter. She had always been his daughter. And Victoria had known. She had known from the moment Clara stepped foot into Harrington Tower, perhaps even before that, known what it would mean to him, known what it would do. And she had tried to erase it, not out of ignorance, not out of misunderstanding, but out of cold, calculated design. And now Everett knew too. The betrayal settled inside him not with rage, but with grief. That someone he had once trusted, once leaned on in the darkest corners of his career, could so casually twist a blade into something so sacred. It was a sorrow deeper than anger could ever reach. Lillian had tried to warn him. There are truths you deserve to know. She had left him breadcrumbs in her journal, soft and trembling words that now burned with purpose. It hadn't just been ambition that had pushed her away, it was fear. Fear of what Victoria might do. Fear of what Everett had become under her influence. And now, with the truth laid bare, Everett realized his greatest betrayal wasn't from someone else. It was from within. He had allowed Victoria too close for too long, had ignored the warnings, overlooked the manipulation, tolerated the quiet power she wielded in boardrooms and behind curtains. Because he'd been too focused on building an empire to notice it was being hollowed from the inside. But not anymore. Well, now. Everett stood, he took the folder, and he left. The car ride to Harrington Tower was quiet. No calls, no assistant, no distractions. He didn't want to be Everett Harrington's CEO. Tonight he was something else. He was a father, a man with something to protect. The building greeted him with polished floors and steel silence. The night staff nodded, too used to his unpredictable hours to question why. He was back at this hour, his coat heavy with rain, his eyes burning with clarity. He didn't stop at his office. He went straight to the 15th floor, Victoria's floor. The door to her private office was slightly ajar. She was inside, standing by the window, wineglass in hand, a view of the city painting her reflection in glass. "Everett," she said, not turning around, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" He didn't answer. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and placed the folder on her desk. Only then did she look. Her eyes flicked to the folder, then back to him. The smile slipped just slightly. "What's this?" she asked. "You tell me," he replied. Victoria moved toward the desk, set her glass down. She opened the folder, glanced at the top sheet, and froze. The silence was sharp. She closed the folder gently, as if it were a sleeping animal. "So, you found it." Everett stared at her. "You lied to me." "I did," she said without flinching. "You altered the test." "Yes." "You knew she was my daughter." "I suspected," she said too evenly. "And when the results confirmed it, I made a choice." "Why?" The question came out broken. Not angry, just hurt. Victoria tilted her head. "Because I saw what was happening. You were unraveling. You were changing. That girl, she was going to destroy everything we'd built." "She's not a girl," Everett said, his voice low. "She's my child." Victoria's jaw tensed. "No, she's your weakness." He stepped closer. "She's the only thing that's made me feel human in years." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "And what does that make me, Everett? I've been by your side for decades. I've protected you, covered for you, helped you rise while everyone else doubted. And for what? To be replaced by some wide-eyed barista who shows up with a sob story in a scrapbook?" "She's not replacing you," he said, "because you were never supposed to be there." The words landed like thunder. Victoria went still. "No," she said slowly. "I was there because you needed me, because you didn't have anyone else, because she left." "She left because of you," Everett said. "Because you threatened her, you scared her away." "I saved you," Victoria hissed. "She was going to ruin you, turn you into a family man with nothing but debt and dreams. I gave you this life. I gave you everything." "No," Everett said quietly. "You took everything." Victoria's hands curled into fists. "What are you going to do, fire me? Destroy me? Throw it all away for her?" "I'm not throwing anything away," he said. "I'm taking it back." And with those words, he turned and left. The following morning, Victoria Chambers was escorted out of Harrington Tower by security. No press release, no parting gift, just a single word printed on her termination notice. Betrayal. The Monarch deal was frozen. The board was informed. The legal team was unleashed. And Everett went home. To Clara, She opened the door slowly, eyes cautious. I took care of it, he said. She didn't speak. He handed her the folder. Everything you need to know is in there. The original results, the logs, the evidence. Her hands shook as she took it. Why she whispered. Because you're my daughter, he said, and no one gets to take you from me, Boyd, again. She looked up at him, eyes filled with something deeper than forgiveness. Recognition, understanding, and love. Not the easy kind, not the fairy tale, the kind that rises from ashes, from pain, from truth. That night, they sat together in silence. Two people once torn apart by secrets, now held together by what remained. Lillian was gone, but her words had led them here, to healing, to something new. It was a morning wrapped in soft gray light, the kind that falls gently across the city like a sigh. Rain had come in the night and washed everything clean. The streets, the air, maybe even the parts of Everett Harrington he didn't realize needed washing. As he stood at the curb outside Clara's apartment, bouquet in hand, he didn't feel like the man who had once built towers from steel and silence. He didn't feel like the man who had ruled boardrooms and made fortunes rise and fall with a signature. He felt like a man arriving at the doorstep of a life he was never sure he deserved, but was ready, finally, to embrace. The door opened before he could knock. Clara stood there in a simple sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back loosely, her eyes still tired from the night before, but clear, brighter somehow. In her hand, she held a small folded piece of paper. Her fingers crumpled its corner as she watched him. I didn't know what flowers she liked, Everett said quietly, lifting the bouquet of wildflowers. So I got all of them. Clara stared at the blossoms, soft yellows, delicate purples, whites with flecks of green, and her lips parted in something between surprise and memory. These were her favorite, she whispered. She used to say they looked like summer had a secret. Everett's throat tightened. Then she told me once, and I just forgot. Clara stepped aside. You didn't forget. You just buried it. He entered, the apartment unchanged except for a candle burning softly near a framed photo of Lillian. Laughing, free, radiant in a way that only someone completely in love could look. Clara noticed his gaze lingering on it. She carried your photo in her wallet until the end, she said. The one of you two on the beach. He nodded, clearing his throat. And now you carry her. She blinked, as if the words hit deeper than she expected. And maybe they did. Because sometimes love comes back to us not in grand gestures or perfect timing, but in the quiet echo of someone simply standing in the doorway with flowers and truth. I was wondering, he said softly, if you'd come with me today. Clara didn't ask where. She just nodded. They drove in silence. Not the silence of distance, but of reverence, of something too big for words. The cemetery was tucked into a hillside where the noise of the city gave way to birdsong and wind. The path was narrow and soft beneath her feet. Clara walked slightly ahead, her steps steady, like she'd been there before many times. Everett followed, bouquet trembling slightly in his hand. When they reached the small headstone, simple, elegant, with Lillian Carter, beloved mother, loved always, etched into gray marble, Everett stopped. He had rehearsed something in his mind, some kind of apology, a speech, words to fill the chasm between what had been and what might have been. But now, standing before the grave of the woman he had loved and lost, and the daughter who had found her way back to him, there was only silence. And then he knelt. He placed the bouquet down gently, brushing a stray petal back into place like it mattered. Like every detail mattered. I found her, he whispered, eyes stinging. Just like you knew I would. Beside him, Clara stood with her arms folded across her chest, her jaw clenched in that familiar way that said her emotions were knocking at the door, but she wasn't ready to let them in. Not yet. I didn't come for a long time after she died, she said finally. I thought it would make it worse. And did it? He asked. She looked at him, and for the first time since they met, her expression was completely unguarded. No, she said, it made it real. He nodded slowly, staring at the stone. I should have come sooner, he said. I should have found her. I should have. But the rest of the sentence dissolved into the air. I think she knew you would, Clara said gently. Maybe not when, but someday. He stood, brushing dirt from his knees. There was a bench nearby beneath a tree, its branches bare and reaching. They sat. Clara pulled that folded piece of paper from her pocket and handed it to him. She wrote this. The night she gave me the journal. She said not to open it unless I found you. Everett unfolded the note slowly, the paper soft from being handled too often. Lillian's handwriting met him like an old friend. If you're reading this, then it means the impossible happened. She found you. You're sitting beside her now, and I hope, oh God, I hope you're looking at her the way you used to look at me, with that quiet awe, that stillness, that thing that made me believe anything was possible. She's stronger than I ever was, smarter, braver. She's your daughter in every way that matters. Love her, not because you missed the first 20 years, but because you still have time. Everett folded the paper and placed it gently in his coat pocket, like a sacred artifact. Clara was quiet beside him. The wind whispered through the branches above. I want to show you something, and he said. She raised an eyebrow. Come on, we'll take my car. The drive north took just over an hour. Out of the city, past the suburban sprawl, and into the winding roads of Westchester where trees lined the streets and the world seemed to breathe easier. Clara didn't ask where they were going. She just stared out the window, watching the buildings give way to fields and forest. When the car turned into a gravel driveway and rolled to a stop before a quiet two-story colonial home wrapped in ivy and memory, Clara looked over at him. What is this place? I bought it for her, Everett said softly. 23 years ago, as a surprise. She never saw it. Clara's breath caught. He led her to the front door, reached above the frame, and retrieved a tarnished brass key. I've never let it go, he said. I couldn't. Inside, the house was still and dust-covered, a museum to what might have been. Furniture draped in sheets, empty picture frames on the mantel, rooms waiting to be lived in. I imagined her here, he said, voice rough. The kitchen was for her. She loved to cook, even when she burned half of it. That room, he pointed down the hall, was going to be her studio, for her photography. And upstairs, he paused. There were 3 bedrooms. One of them was yours. Clara stood frozen in the entryway, her hand resting on the banister. You built a life for us, she said, voice barely above a whisper, and then never lived it. Everett didn't respond. He didn't have to. She stepped into the living room, running her fingers along the edge of a covered couch. I want to fix it up, she said suddenly. Clean it. Bring it back. It's yours, he said. All of it. She turned to him, tears finally falling freely now. No, it's ours. And with those words, the air changed. Not everything could be undone, but some things could still be written. That evening, they sat on the front porch as the sun slipped behind the hills, the sky painted in soft gold and lavender. Clara held a photo album she had brought from her apartment, and Everett listened as she told stories about birthday parties, quiet nights, Lillian's little rituals. She used to dance in the kitchen when she thought I wasn't looking, Clara said, usually to Ella Fitzgerald. She danced like that in college, Everett smiled, even when there wasn't music. Clara looked at him. Do you think she forgave you? He paused. I think she never stopped loving me. Clara nodded slowly. That's not the same thing. No, he agreed, but it's a place to start. As darkness fell and the porch light flickered on, Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. I don't want this to be temporary, she said. Neither do I, he whispered. They stayed like that, wrapped in silence. The weight of everything they'd lost cradled gently beside everything they still had. The sun was just beginning to rise when Everett Harrington stepped out onto the porch of the old Westchester house, a warm cup of coffee in his hands and the sound of birdsong gently greeting the new day. The light broke through the trees in golden shafts, catching on dew-speckled grass and painting the world in a soft, forgiving glow. It was quiet here, far from the city towers he once called home, far from the marble offices and boardroom battles that had defined most of his adult life. For the first time in decades, Everett wasn't rushing. He wasn't calculating. He wasn't commanding empires. He was simply present. Inside, Clara was still asleep. She'd spent most of the previous evening organizing old photographs, sorting through dusty boxes from the attic, and laughing at her mother's sense of nostalgia. Lillian had saved everything. Ticket stubs, handwritten grocery lists, Polaroids faded to sepia, and now those memories had come home, filling the house Everett had once built in secret, hoping to surprise the woman he loved. A house that had remained frozen in time, waiting for life to return to it. And now it had. Life had returned in the form of laughter echoing through the hallways, in the clatter of mugs in the kitchen, in the gentle creak of the stairs as Clara moved from room to room, claiming each space not as a stranger, but as someone meant to be here all along. Everett sat down on the porch steps, sipping his coffee slowly, watching the trees sway in a soft morning breeze. He had spent decades chasing success. He had built towers and crushed competition, forged partnerships and dissolved them, made fortunes and watched others fall. The world had applauded him, envied him, feared him. But no one had truly known him. Not really, not since Lillian. Until now. Now there was Clara, his daughter, his anchor, his mirror, and the legacy he had never expected to leave. The house, once a monument to regret, was now alive with the sounds of shared meals, quiet conversations, and the occasional off-key singing of jazz classics from the kitchen. They hadn't redecorated much. Clara insisted the soul of the house was still Lillian's, and she wanted to preserve that. Instead, they added little things, bookshelves, framed photos, new curtains in the guest room that was quickly becoming Everett's preferred place to stay when he left the city. Because the truth was, the city no longer felt like home. This did. This quiet porch, this chipped coffee mug, this house that was once a dream. Now it was real. Now it was theirs. The company still ran, of course. Harrington Industries didn't vanish just because Everett's priorities shifted. But the way he engaged with it changed. He delegated more, spoke less. He no longer sought to control every outcome, and he'd begun using the company's resources in different ways, funding scholarships in Lillian's name, starting a foundation to support single mothers and struggling students. One of Clara's first suggestions had been to fund a photography grant for underprivileged young artists. The board didn't like it at first, but Everett didn't care. Let them grumble, let them wonder what had changed. He knew. Clara had changed him. Love had changed him. And not the dramatic, sweeping kind that burns like fire and fades. This was the slow, steady kind. The kind that heals. Clara emerged from the front door behind him, barefoot, wearing one of his old sweaters that hung off her shoulders. Her hair was pulled up, her eyes still sleepy. "Coffee?" she asked. He handed her his cup. She took it, smiling softly. "Couldn't sleep," she said, sitting beside him. "Too much peace and quiet?" he teased. "Too many thoughts," she replied. But the good kind. They sat in silence, sipping coffee from the same mug, watching the day begin. The birds continued to sing, and the breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and something blooming nearby. "You know," she said eventually, "I think she would have loved seeing this." "I hope so," Everett whispered. "She always believed people could change, even if it took time." "She was right," he said, looking at her. "I just wish I'd changed sooner." Clara rested her head on his shoulder. "You changed exactly when I needed you to." The tears came then, quietly. Not many, just a few, just enough to say, "This matters. This is real. This is home." Dear listener, if you followed this story to the end, then maybe, just maybe, you felt something stir inside you. Maybe you've known what it feels like to lose time you can never get back. Maybe you've carried a regret so heavy it left shadows in your life. Maybe you've wondered if it's too late to say something, to fix something, to become someone better. This story isn't just about a billionaire and a girl from Brooklyn. It's about second chances. It's about how love, real, unconditional love, can heal what ambition once destroyed. It's about how sometimes we don't need more time. We just need the courage to use the time we have left differently. So if you've ever wanted to reconnect with someone, do it. If there's a letter you haven't sent, write it. If there's a door you've been afraid to knock on, knock. Because healing often comes not with answers, but with presence. And hope? Hope doesn't knock loud. It whispers in the silence of a porch, in the warmth of a coffee mug shared between a father and daughter, in the soft realization that it's not too late. Everett Harrington didn't find redemption in wealth or fame or skyscrapers. He found it in the quiet courage of a young woman who didn't ask for anything but the truth. And in giving her that, he found himself again. So, my dear friends, if this story touched your heart, if you were moved by Everett and Clara's journey, if it reminded you of something you've lost or something you've found, please let them know. Leave a comment below. Let Everett know you believe in him. Let Clara know you're rooting for her future. Let them both know that their story mattered. Click the like button, because every bit of encouragement helps stories like this reach the people who need to hear them most. And if you want more touching, meaningful stories, stories that speak to the soul and remind us that love, family, and healing are never out of reach, subscribe to the channel. Here we tell stories not just to entertain, but to heal, to inspire, to remind you that life isn't measured in wealth or power, but in the people who wait for us to come home. Thank you for listening. Until next time, take care of each other. And don't forget, some truths deserve to be known. And some hearts, no matter how long they've waited, still have the capacity to love again.